Given the rather muted display for Final Fantasy at both E3 and Gamescom this year, when looking at the Tokyo Game Show, it also felt like there probably wouldn't be much to talk about. Expectations were set pretty low, and I mean, it made sense to think that way. Outside of the mobile games, which have had God knows how many cameos taking place from all over the place in the last couple of months, and Final Fantasy XIV, which has still been pumping out content like there's no tomorrow, whether we like it or not, and I'm looking at you, Mr. Final Fantasy VII Remake, the rest of the brand has taken a back seat this year to make way for other projects like Dragon Quest XI and Kingdom Hearts 3. I was going to say that it was therefore pleasantly surprising to see that my expectations were actually exceeded, but who am I kidding? I'm genuinely buzzing right now. And why, you might ask? Well, it's because in their infinite wisdom, Square Enix has taken the decision to bring the Crystal Chronicles franchise back from the dead, and they're doing it, in my opinion at least, in the right way, as they've just announced that they are currently working on Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles Remastered for the PlayStation 4 and Nintendo Switch, and that it's due to release at some point next year. Now, as some of you may or may not know, the original Crystal Chronicles is a game that had a really positive impact on me, and before talking about my excitement for this new announcement, it feels like the perfect time to talk about just why Crystal Chronicles was so impactful to me. I mean, at the time, I had never played anything like it, Final Fantasy or otherwise. The experience was just so unique. But if we're being insular, outside of Final Fantasy XI, the franchise had pretty much always been a single player experience. And yes, I'm aware that Final Fantasy IX technically had multiplayer, as you could use the second controller. But if we ignore that rogue gameplay element, it meant that from an offline perspective, when Crystal Chronicles released in 2004 on the Gamecube, it was nothing short of a game changer. Having sold over 1 million units worldwide, Crystal Chronicles was a strong performer, and it also received decent reviews. But the main issue around its perception was that while there was a single player offering, this ended up being quite slow paced and dry. Indeed, to play the game as it was truly intended, and to be able to view it as the game changer that I feel it was, you needed to play the multiplayer. But the problem was that there was a significant barrier to entry. You needed to have 1. A Gamecube, 2. A Game Boy Advance, 3. A Game Boy Advance link cable, and 4. You needed to have 3 friends who were local to you who also each had their own Game Boy Advance and link cable. It meant that the logistics behind playing and the financial outlay were pretty hefty, and this is just me making an educated guess, but I doubt many of the people who purchased the game ever got to experience it in this way. I therefore count myself as being rather fortunate, as when Crystal Chronicles released, I was at university and was sharing a house with some really good friends. We also all just happened to have Game Boy Advances, so after picking up some link cables, it was really easy for us to just crowd around a TV and take part in some cooperative dungeon crawling. And we had an absolute blast. I'd say the only game that got even close to rivaling the fun we had was Mario Party 5, which had classic minigames like Pushy Penguins. I think the reason why is that the development team, which was helmed by Kazuhiko Ioki, created the perfect framework for both collaboration and competition to thrive. You needed to work together with your allies in order to progress through the game's various challenges, but the game also promoted working towards your own personal goals too, sometimes in spite of those wider objectives. And this mindset could be seen right at the start of the game, as despite there being multiple races, no 2 players could play as the same race. You'd therefore have to think about the different roles you'd want to play and whether or not the race you wanted to play as was aligned to that. As for example, the Lilties were better suited to melee players, while the Ukes were more suited to those who preferred using magic. This was also where the requirement of having the Game Boy Advance act as your controller really came to the fore. The Gamecube of course already had 4 controller ports, but by using the Game Boy Advance, it meant that each player was granted access to their own personal screen, which would contain something that was unique to their character. For example, only one of the party members was given access to a map, and their role within that level would therefore be to help guide the team in the right direction. Another may have been made aware of the locations of treasure chests, while another would have been given access to information related to the enemies you were fighting, ranging from their hit points through to elemental weaknesses. It meant that collaboration and communication was essential, especially with how the combat system worked. Each character could of course perform individual attacks, but when combined you could perform fusion spells which would be much more powerful, and there were numerous spells that were also multiplayer exclusive. The Game Boy Advance screen was also used to highlight your own personal objective that you would need to work towards, and these may have been counterintuitive to your party setup or detrimental to the party's overall performance. For example, you may be required to take damage or not cast any magical spells, and if you were the healer, that would be very difficult to try and achieve. But if you managed to still get the highest score against your objective by the end of the level, you would be able to upgrade your character more than your peers, as you would gain the first pick against artifacts that were on offer. Needless to say, when you then threw in the glorious soundtrack composed by Kumi Tanioka, a decent story and some compelling mini-games like the cow racing at the Fields of Fun, it made for a fulfilling experience that would allow for the forging of meaningful friendships. It's a sentiment that Square Enix obviously agreed with, but at the time the company was all about polymorphic content. They jumped on any possible success and tried to squeeze everything they possibly could out of it, and sadly, the Crystal Chronicles franchise just couldn't sustain itself. That's not to say the games that followed the original were necessarily bad. Ring of Fates was a strong follow-up, and I've heard that the WiiWare spin-off titles were also pretty good. It's just that the franchise lost its way and became oversaturated following Square Enix's decision to release 5 Crystal Chronicles games in the space of just 2 years. Echoes of Time, which was the last true Crystal Chronicles experience, also ended up being a technical disaster, as they chose to port the DS version to the Wii instead of actually making a version of the game for the Wii, and by the time they got around to the Crystal Bearers, we were in spin-off of a spin-off territory, and that rarely ever ends well. It was by far the worst performing game in the franchise from the perspective of both critical reception and sales, and following its poor showing, Crystal Chronicles was banished to the archives. Until now, some 9 years later. So let's get on to some immediate thoughts about the Crystal Chronicles Remaster. Outside of the trailer, which was only around 30 seconds long and was shown during the PlayStation lineup tour press conference at TGS, Square Enix haven't really said anything else so far beyond the fact it's planned to release at some point next year in Japan. We can infer from the trailer though that multiplayer is going to be a big focus of the experience, and that unlike before, where you were obviously confined to your living rooms, now you will be able to leverage new technologies like the internet to be able to play with people all across the globe, although it's unlikely that you'll be able to play cross-platform between the PlayStation 4 and the Switch, as Sony have made it very clear recently that they won't support crossplay on the majority of games, as they want everyone to buy games exclusively on their systems. The reason? They deem the experience on other consoles to be inferior, and don't want to promote lesser gaming experiences. The ironic thing about this is that the Nintendo Switch may actually end up being the best place to pick up the Crystal Chronicles Remaster due to how the console is set up. As mentioned, one of the most interesting aspects of the original was the utilization of the second screen, which is something the PlayStation 4 doesn't have. To replicate the experience of the original, the developers may therefore need to modify the experience for the system in order to find new ways of implementing the multiplayer mechanics from the original. From the footage we've seen so far, this may be as simple as just superimposing additional information onto the screen, as you can clearly see the minimap is present in the top right hand corner. This could just be a placeholder though, but as mentioned earlier, in the original, this level of information was only reserved to one player on their Game Boy Advance screen. In terms of the multiplayer, the minimap is present on all 4 screens in the video, but I wouldn't read too much into that at this moment in time, given that all 4 screens are just replicating each other. It's probably just a goof in the video editing, but we will have to wait and see. If it is a case that the minimap will appear on screen though, it could be that they are choosing to alter some of the functionality from the original game, and it will be interesting to see how well they will handle this. Likewise, they could also be thinking about removing some of this additional multiplayer functionality, but I think that would be a rather disappointing move, and it's one I hope they don't entertain. From looking at the visuals, it doesn't look like too much has really been done to try and modernize anything. I mean, everything they showed off in the trailer looked decent enough, and there is clearly now way more on screen than in the original game, but outside of that, it doesn't look like they will be making wholesale changes. I mean, that's fine and all, and perhaps this is just me wanting the best, but I'd kind of like to see changes similar to what we saw with Final Fantasy Type 0 when it was ported from the PSP to the PS4 and Xbox One. I mean, even in that instance, the graphics we ended up with still weren't exactly stellar, but the improvement when looking at things side by side was rather stark. It wasn't an ideal situation, but you could tell that they tried to make it look as good as they possibly could. I just hope that they leave the music well alone. With some of the recent Final Fantasy remasters, Square Enix has decided to go back and revisit the soundtracks too, and so far it's been a rather mixed bag, especially when looking at the Final Fantasy X HD remaster. While there were some tracks like People of the North that really benefited from the update, others like Challenge just lost all of their personality. Final Fantasy XII The Zodiac Age turned out alright though, but so much of the charm from the music in the original Crystal Chronicles was around its instrumentation and tribal themes. I just think it would be dangerous to try and play around with that too much. My main thought about this remaster though isn't anything to do with gameplay, graphics and music. It's that I'm just so glad the experience can now be shared. Even if we ignore the original barriers to entry, as time has passed, trying to play the original version with 4 players has become harder and harder. And over the last 10 years or so, I've eulogized about how good the multiplayer experience was with Crystal Chronicles, and I'm so happy that a new generation of players will now be able to check out their experience with so much more ease. I just hope that it all holds up. I mean, it's now been some 14 years since I last played Crystal Chronicles, so I'm well aware that nostalgia may be doing an absolute number on me. Then again, 2 of my favourite games of all time, Sonic 2 and Streets of Rage 2, still hold up pretty well, so what am I worried about, right? Either way, how excited are you guys about the news of the Crystal Chronicles Remaster? And how many of you guys actually had the chance to play it with 3 other people when it first came out, back on the Gamecube? Let us know in the comments below, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Also, and I appreciate the game is still quite a while away, but if you'd like to join our ever-growing community so that when the Crystal Chronicles Remaster does eventually come out, you've got plenty of people to party up with, why not check out our Discord server? There's a link in the description below, and we'd be happy to have you. And while I've got your attention, why not also consider supporting us on Patreon? You get the satisfaction of knowing that you're helping to support us in the creation of these videos, and we'll also reward you with, amongst other things, putting your name at the end of video like these guys you're seeing right now. Alright guys, this is a super excited Daryl signing out. I will see you next time for more Final Fantasy videos.